All right, welcome back to Radio Wasteland and our guest, Bruce R. Fenton. Tonight we're going to be talking about Exogenesis, his new book, Hybrid Humans, A Scientific History of Extraterrestrial Genetic Manipulation. That's a full title. You know, this is something I've always been interested in because so many people are so incredibly convinced on this one. And it's a topic that has been floating around on, shows like Ancient Aliens and stuff like that for quite some time. And seeing how I have no advanced scientific degree, I don't really have a huge understanding of what this entirely means and why we think this is the case. So why don't we explain, first, let's explain exogenesis. Why the title Exogenesis?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good place to start because that is technically the beginning of our story. So exogenesis is an alternate term for panspermia, the argument that life on Earth began via processes carrying simple organisms through space, probably on comets, but possibly on dust in interstellar dust clouds or other means. You can also have directed panspermia, which infers that an intelligence is behind the propagation of these organisms and possibly sends out small metal containers with organic material in them, and that these rain down onto planetary surfaces, or of course ships land and life is dropped off. So there's different ways of looking at exogenesis, panspermia. Now, there's a good reason why I suspect that that's the true story of the origins of life on Earth. Now, because the current preferred hypothesis is abiogenesis, the idea that DNA emerged out of random geological and chemical processes, and that life, came out of possibly some hot mineral rock pool somewhere, in some strange anomalous type event, which we don't understand. I mean, to this day, no experiment has, been able to replicate an abiogenesis event. So it's entirely hypothetical. So equally so are the competing models, which are, of course, creationism, the idea that God intervenes and Earth is essentially a creation, life is created on Earth. And again, this is hypothetical, you can't test this. And the third one being exogenesis and abiogenesis, which suffers from some of the same problems. So there is something to say, look, we don't know for sure which one of these is correct. Now, simply the preferred one is abiogenesis. Now, why do I think exogenesis is right? I'll tell you why. It's because if we look at the beginning of this story, it turns out that the first life on this planet emerges somewhere around 4.5 billion years ago. And that's supported from two directions. You have the fossil record, where we have early organisms turning up about 4.2 billion years ago in the fossil record. And the inference there is that we are unlikely to have found the earliest fossil life, right? So we wouldn't have got that lucky yet. So if you give it 4.2 in the record, there's a good chance it goes back to around 4.5 in reality. So that's their estimate. Now, from the genetic studies, they've looked to see when was the last universal common ancestor of all life on this planet living, which they call Luca. And that this actually turns out to have been around about 4.5 billion years ago. And this is, again, estimated from genetic studies. So if you think about it, we have two lines of evidence. We have the fossil record and we have the genetics, both pointing to this event 4.5 billion years ago. The planet itself is 4.6 billion years old. So in just 100 million years, we've gone from lava, chaos, bombardment, suddenly, and life has appeared. Now, this is quite staggering. It was long thought it took perhaps a billion years of random events to lead to DNA emerging. Now it turns out that as soon as the planet's surface was suitable to host life, life appeared. Now, I'd say that fits much better with delivery of life from space than a long series of random geological and chemical processes.
Yeah, that makes sense, especially like, when the planet's forming, it's forming out of things that aren't the planet, that are coming from other places and stuff like that, meaning that...
Well, yes, I mean, absolutely, yes. I mean, you could say that if any of that debris that is involved in this, say cometary debris, is carrying microorganisms, again, that would be a panspermia origin for life. It would mean that those simple organisms already existed on some of that debris in our solar system, and that have ended up, on the planet's surface at the right moment. Of course, it could equally be a directed panspermia, but either one of those, in either case, I think that panspermia better explains such a fast emergence of life on this planet.
So of these sort of two strains you mentioned of exogenesis, do you have any reason to favor one over the other at this point? Or
yeah, I do personally.
Directed versus non-directed? Absolutely,
yes. In my view, I think that went partly because of the speed of this. It looks almost timed with the moment this planet is suitable to host life that it appears, and I find that astonishingly convenient, and that almost highlights that there's some likelihood that it's a deliberate event. That the planet's ready, let's seed the life on there. But also because we have evidence from, I guess, in my book, my research, that there is an intelligence operating in the solar system and beyond, in which case, again, that increases the chances that we are dealing with a engineered event. Because there's one of the arguments in mainstream science and in SETI and in space science is that how would aliens find us? Right? Why would aliens stumble on us? In this vast universe, what's the chances of them happening upon us? Now, you could say it's fairly low if it's just through chaotic means. That they're slowly exploring the galaxy, they stumble on us. However, if they've seeded worlds and they are monitoring these worlds, then you can explain this interaction that so many people claim that they have interacted with beings or they've seen craft and all of these things, which they fit better with that model. And again, one of the reasons why these craft and events are dismissed is that chance, that the scientists say, well, what's the chance they would have found us? But they're ignoring the possibility that if the planet is seeded and is being interacted with the whole time, some shepherding from an intelligence, then yes, we would expect to see indications of that shepherding intelligence. And I contest that we do, that we see this throughout prehistory into distant, and ancient history written accounts and into the modern day. So that's why I would say that, the evidence in our recorded history points to contact, and the idea that there's a contact better fits with there being an intelligence that's already been aware of life forming on this planet. Because the only thing interesting here is life. I mean, there's plenty of planets out there. We know that now. There's billions. So why would an intelligence be interested in Earth? The only thing we have which we see as being rare in space is life. So how do they know that we're here? How do they know there's life? I think that fits better with them seeding the planet in the first place.
We do have very nice mountains.
We have to love the scenery.
Good hiking, yeah.
It's the skiing. So exogenesis, so the title of the book, and now that I'm getting the exogenesis, implies that that this has happened twice, because to be a hybrid human, they would have had to have come back. They didn't hybridize. I'm getting the impression that they didn't hybridize the bacteria or the formulations of life, that they hybridized the human. So they would have had to have come back somewhere in the evolutionary process and done it again. Is that the implication?
Well, I would suggest that we have a shepherding, almost a farming that's happening here. So if you look at, say, the Cambrian Explosion, where we suddenly have a huge number of organisms that appear in the fossil record that don't have precursors, right? Which has been a mystery in evolutionary sciences for a long time. Creationists suggest that this infers the hand of God reaching in, and there's been a big debate about that. But if you look at the work of, say, Professor Chandra Wickramasinghe, who's an astrobiologist, used to work with the legendary Fred Hoyle, essentially the founders of panspermia theory, that, he points out that this can be better explained by ongoing panspermia events, that if you have a retrovirus that rains down from space, and again, there's huge amounts of viruses raining down all the time from the upper atmosphere. He contests that a lot of these are coming from space, right? So this is a controversial idea, but there's a lot of academics on his side, and recently I had a paper co-authored with 30 or so other scientists suggesting that the Cambrian Explosion is one of these moments where a virus rains down, infects the organisms on the planet, and that then the information in those viruses essentially uploads into the genome. And that causes these mutagenic events. And also viruses spreading between different species, right? They can carry information, characteristics of those species. It's what's called horizontal gene transfer, that, aspects of one organism can be carried across to another via these viral infections. And this is a key part of evolution. In fact, we know that the human genome is full of evidence of viral carcasses and viral information that's become part of us, that we wouldn't be how we are now without these viral infections, which is quite incredible. Now, one of the things you can do, of course, with viruses, you can modify them. Now, I contest that what we have here is an ongoing process of modified retroviruses being introduced into the upper atmosphere, raining down and modifying life. That this is, again, these are the fingerprints of the shepherding of this planet, and that this happens recurrently. However, in the time when we reach hominins, in my view, for a number of reasons we will cover, I do contest that this is a direct event where there is actually a landing and a direct focus on early hominins, which involves a kind of something like a CRISPR type technology being utilized to specifically change aspects of an early hominin. So this is different to the processes that have been causing jumps in evolution in the past, that in particularly in the human lineage, that yes, we have an event with a craft coming here, with beings arriving, and them directly experimenting on a group of hominins.
So these aliens are going to have to be, many, many billions of years old. They're going to have to be staggeringly advanced to make all of this work.
Mm-hmm.
Just sort of mind-boggling to wrap your head around, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I would assume, again, I can't say, how, but once we start dealing with the ability to travel through the universe, I mean, our assumption would be that this is something like wormhole travel, or alkyl drives, either bending space-time, warping it around a craft, or, doing these kind of, exotic mechanisms to travel. So knowing that these are so far off for us, they're so hypothetical. But yeah, I think you have to be dealing with a civilization that is at least tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years ahead to be at this level.
That raises something I hadn't thought of, which is that, these creatures, because I was thinking, so what, they're just seeding the planet and then they're just waiting for 4 billion years, but like you said, they would have, time being relative and all, they would have access to ways to speed up their perception of the process.
You can go into this in a way that's very mind-bending, that, for example, if you have these technologies, essentially you're dealing with time travel as well as space travel. So, and people sort of wonder that, they say, why would you want to do that? But let's say you can see the planet and then you are able to bend space-time and, you go back to wherever you're from, but possibly you can target points in the timeline where you come back and you do certain things and leave again. Now, it's conceivable that the same beings that, the very same beings that do the seeding could come back later, 1 billion years later, and they're still alive because the time for them is not the same for us, right? And this is a kind of, I know it's a mind bender for people, but, it could literally be the same guy or whatever, the same person. I don't know. I mean, who knows what they look like?
Some grad student robot, just doing a product.
Yeah, but it could be that same individual organism or entity or robot or whatever, could come back. And it'd be that very same one. And that's a kind of mind bender because, for us, obviously, billions of years have gone past. But for that individual, that wouldn't necessarily be the case at all if they're using wormhole travel, right?
Sure.
So yeah, I think that's when we clash with these ideas of highly advanced extraterrestrial civilizations, we have to bend our mind in a way to realize that is not like us. And too often we hear people say, well, why would they want to do that? Or we wouldn't do that. Or, it's like, hang on, with alien minds, right? And that aliens that perhaps have technologies that we say that can bend the space continuum, right? So it's unlikely that we are going to have the same drives and impetus and plans as a civilization that operates on an almost godlike scale.
That brings up the disturbing possibility that we're just some kid's school project, because
it's what I was saying. A grad student is just like,
you're right. Yeah, exactly.
It's going to get a C+ on Earth, and it's like, okay, I passed. Whatever. Right. Leave them to their own devices now.
And one concerning thing with that, of course, is what do you do if your project goes wrong? I mean, just
absolutely
reboot it or something. So when you're at possibly the mercies of civilizations like that, there is that that kind of creepy element to it, that not only are you really sort of outclassed in every sense, but they could reset that experiment. And you may be one of so many experiments as to be, rather than being special, as to be really, your project 7,603,000, and we'll just check on them once in a while, but there's better ones out there that are working out better. We kind of have to think like that. And one of the things I found really fascinating recently that came up, and this is a mind bender for people that don't necessarily follow the cutting edge of space science, right? What's going on there? Mm-hmm. There's a chap who I'm trying to think now, a leading thinker in the field, right? Who recently put out a paper saying, an article saying that it's assumed that many of these civilizations, again with the assumption that they're out there, that if there's many of these advanced civilizations, that a lot of them, perhaps 90% or more, will be post-biological, and that they will have transitioned to either uploading themselves into silicon networks and existing as echoes of themselves in AI networks, or their technologies will outlive them, and that the biological forms have become extinct, but their robots and their AI crafts and all these things will go on, essentially, indefinitely, long after biology has vanished. Now, there's a lot of reasons why that's likely. I mean, obviously, we can kind of infer it from ourselves, being the only life that we are well studied. We can see that in terms of intelligent life, we are already creating these machines that if we disappeared tomorrow, at least for some period, our robots or AI could go on for a while without us, that some of these machines could. Now, if we have something, if we were, say, 200 years time from now, what would we have? We probably would have kinds of either post-biological people to some degree and AI and stuff that we could run on without us, from solar power and all the rest doesn't really need us. So if that's true, if there's a lot of those out there, first of all, it gives us a good chance that that's who we would meet first, rather than biological life, the machines, of some civilization. Secondly, if you could upload yourself, you can also potentially download yourself. And this is what this scientist was saying, that, could it be that they reach a point where they decide that post-biological existence actually isn't preferable to biological existence, and they decide to go the other way? Now, let's say that before you upload yourself, you set a reset point. Now, what would a reset point be like for a godlike civilization that's doing a project like this? It might be the seeding of a world that will produce a large number of biological containers for consciousness, that then if you wish to return to the physical biological world, that you can return to that planet and download yourself into the fetuses of that species.
Wouldn't it be easier for them to just, make a farm? Test people grown in test tubes, then they can control the process a little bit, at least.
Well, I suppose
rather than seeding a planet.
Well, I suppose it's one way, isn't it? I mean, it depends on why, and again, what works better. I mean, if you have a huge lab, it becomes like a sort of planet in the end, isn't it? I mean, how do you get this whole thing to keep going happily along without you? I suppose you need the infrastructure, and what nature does really is provides the infrastructure to keep alive all of these beings, these entities. Whereas if you have a lab, you kind of have to be hands-on with a lab, and you're the one running it, keeping it going, energy going into it, focusing on it. If you're focusing on some other project, you decide to experience being in the AI world, you could probably have some vast lab like that, but then possibly, and again, I'm just speculating, possibly they're working it out, they realize it's easier to have it as a planet. So if we have something like that, we could have a situation where such beings arrived here and said, they want to return to biology. I mean, that'd be a creepy kind of scenario where it's like, well, we turn up and we've grown you so that we can utilize you, as vessels. So who knows? We could deal with.
It's like we're an organ farm, like a giant organ farm.
Don't like that.
No,
are all of these theories absolutely terrifying?
They don't have to be, but I think it's that thing. I like to encourage people to expand beyond the simple ideas of aliens thinking like humans, that they want to come and get water, or they want to come get gold, or they want to take us over and be slaves, right? Well, these are sort of what I consider simplistic human concerns about extraterrestrials, rather than higher level, if you're dealing with beings that can go to any planet they want, right? If they want land, resources, minerals, water, that stuff is abundant.
Right.
Totally
universe.
I agree with you. I've always had a problem with the idea that we were some sort of slave class or something like that, created by a technology that should be able to create nanotech, that should be able to take apart a planet and turn it into robot helpers. It's like, this actually comes closer to me to the idea of why one would do this. And, even down the lines of 2001: A Space Odyssey, of just spreading life for the sake of spreading life, because all of the universe is similar and that life is where interesting things happen, was kind of the implication of 2001.
Well, yeah, and also in that we see there that we don't really encounter the biological organisms. We encounter their machines, what appears to be a kind of silica block, which we can assume is something like an AI, silica network, like probe or whatever, what we call a Bracewell probe. Bracewell Sentinel probe is something you can leave on a planetary surface, which will monitor, record data, can give contact back to another planet, and potentially can be programmed to activate and make contact with a civilization once it reaches a certain level and interact. Now that's a hypothetical object in obviously space sciences, but what we see in 2001: A Space Odyssey is essentially a Bracewell probe. And so that's kind of funny because, again, the likelihood is that we would have at least initial encounters with the technologies of other civilizations rather than the biological organism. Again, to do the laws of probability. If there's 90% probably not post-biological systems, and if we assume all advanced civilizations use technology, because again, that's kind of what we're saying when we say advanced, that they have to be able to fly around in ships or bend space-time. So their machinery is far more likely to connect with us first in some sense, right? So I think 2001: A Space Odyssey does a good job of reflecting that the beings themselves may be so far beyond us as to, simply employ their technologies for the most part to deal with other planets and other civilizations and stuff, right? And again, biology is not usually well suited to space travel. It could be that entities can put themselves into suspended animation, or that they may have lifespans that are just extraordinarily long, or that they're cybernetically enhanced and they live a long time. But we would usually assume biology is not well suited to vast periods in space. Or, there's all these assumptions that all your beginning parts of your exploration of the galaxy would utilize probes, even if later on you transcend that with wormholes. But you want to have these probes out there first, at some point in your civilization's development. So we should in fact have vast numbers of probes in the Milky Way. I mean, that's again another inferred understanding that if all civilizations out there reach a stage where they explore, that they all start with AI exploration and probes, those probes should be everywhere.
All right, you are listening to Radio Wasteland, and our guest, Bruce R. Fenton. We're talking about Exogenesis, human hybrids, a scientific history of extraterrestrial genetic manipulation. Come on back. All right, welcome back to Radio Wasteland and our guest, Bruce R. Fenton. We're talking about his books, Exogenesis, Human Hybrids, A Scientific History of Extraterrestrial Genetic Manipulation. Before the break, we talked about exogenesis, which is, I was thinking it was interesting that and also necessary that we use a different term, because as we discussed what it possibly meant, we all have this idea that panspermia is... if it were to happen, would be a natural event.
Yeah.
And I was kind of joking to myself. I'm just all like, the spermia part of it, while a natural event is a act done on purpose, So I thought it was interesting that we still have to use a different term because, in order to make a life form, people have to actually put the effort in and stuff like that. But I understand using the term exogenesis now that we've covered all of the different possibilities. Go ahead, Carrie. You're about to make fun of me for my comparison.
This just went to a weird place. That's all I'm saying.
It always does. It always does. But, what proof do we have? Well, I don't know if proof is the right word. What clues are left behind that are leading us to believe this? In your book, you cite ancient sacred Aboriginal artifacts. You know, how is this telling us that this might be a possibility?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's certainly a peculiar area, but it connects back to something we talked about earlier. These Bracewell probes. Now, there is a class of artifacts that are known in anthropological studies, in Indigenous Australian communities, particularly in, I think it's the central north, the Arrente people around Uluru and some related areas in that language group, where they have these artifacts called Chiringas, or Chiringa stones. Now, the mythology or the cultural history says that these are kind of beings from the Alchiringa time, which is the creation time when humans were created, some of the other life on this planet, certain features in the landscape were formed, and that there were these original Alchiringa beings that were involved in this. And that some of these either sort of transformed themselves or migrated into forms that would be able to stand the test of time and all the elements and would persist up until now. And they say that these Chiringa stones are these beings. And so you have an object that looks sort of like a tablet, like a tablet of stone, which I would suggest probably are silica, and that they have usually some symbols on them. So we know that there are fairly modern artifacts like that. I mean, that there's a tradition of creating copies of older ones. Now, they're considered to be just as sacred as the older ones, but there is also the understanding that there were some original Chiringas that were left by the Alchiringa beings in this creation time. Now, in the book, I detail an encounter between an Australian lady and one of these Chiringas that came to be at her home for a temporary period whilst it was en route to be returned to the Indigenous custodians in Uluru area. Whilst this was held in her home, she began having a series of very strange events, a kind of a direct, what we'd call now, voice-to-skull communication, which is something that's being worked on in MIT and elsewhere, that the object was able to somehow communicate directly to her mind, telling her that this was it was an Alchiringa being from that time, and that it had all this information about human history, prehistory, going all the way back to an event where a craft arrived here and was involved in, well, the beings were involved in modifying early hominins. And it ended up with this, what is really a long narrative on how these beings came here, what the ship was like, why it ended up being destroyed, why they involved themselves in engineering us. Essentially a complete, what you'd call, I suppose, like a download. But we're more familiar with these from, I suppose, typical kind of channeling or contactee stories, but usually in those cases there's no physical object involved, right? There's obviously there's books and stories out there about people having experiences where just suddenly they find that there's a being talking to them, or they see a UFO and suddenly they're in communication with it, or these are stories that abound. But the unusual thing here, of course, is that none of this happens until this artifact arrives. So it seems to be that it is indeed responsible for initiating this contact. Now, I personally am convinced that what we have here is a type of Bracewell probe. Now, if anyone looks into the understanding of these objects, there's a lot of writings out there. The one class of these sentinel probes that are, as we talked about earlier, that can stay on a planet and await the emergence of a civilization and can make contact, that would fit very well with this. And again, they could be activated by something like picking up the development of radio waves, or picking up the development of some specific technology which would suggest that planet has reached a level of advancement that makes it suitable for a direct contact event. And that's kind of extraordinary, but again, it kind of meshes because, of course, we are now in the space age, right, with all these crazy technologies flying around, and we're sort of at the edges of going out there, and then this object seems to have chosen this moment to kind of make contact. So that's the foundation of what the research was about. And then, really, I went on to consider some of its biggest claims, about a specific craft, a large silica network craft arriving here, being destroyed, the engineering, and looked for the evidence for those.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. There, you also cited the wreckage of a huge colony ship getting identified, along with associated NASA studies, and the material. Can you explain that? That why is this the first I'm hearing of it? What's giving us the implication that this happened?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of extraordinary in many ways. Obviously, it's an extraordinary story from the get-go, but this material that I talk about is extraordinary, australite tektite. Now, I was kind of surprised I'd never heard of it, and I'll tell you why, because when you start digging into this topic, and bear in mind, I was looking for what was described as being molten debris from a huge silica craft. It was described as being destroyed in orbit, and that material melted, and some of it rained down across the planet. So obviously I went away looking into the geological records, was there anything like that? I didn't really think I would find anything, even though I was personally convinced that this story was genuine, enough to go and look into it, right? Instead of just thinking, okay, that was interesting. But I didn't really think that over hundreds of thousands of years there would be much evidence would remain, even in a real event. So I was quite shocked when I went and looked and found that there was this material called australite tektite, which it turns out is indeed a melted silica that debris that has rained down across the planet from Antarctica to southern China in this vast debris field. About 20% of the planet's surface is covered, has some of this material on it, right? Well, that's an enormous debris field. And so it also transpires that there is a 100-year-long scientific mystery around this, with hundreds and hundreds of academic papers from space science, from geologists, where they're investigating this to try and understand, how it formed, and this huge mystery. So as an ancient mysteries researcher, I was kind of astonished just in the fact I'd never heard of it. And I don't know, I don't know if either of you have heard of australite.
No, I haven't. No.
No. So you'd be quite amazed to find that there's this 100-year-long debate, and that there's essentially two camps of scientists that have been arguing over whether this material resulted from an impact on the moon, which caused debris to be exploded off, and some of it to reach Earth and rain down, or whether there was some kind of object which impacted probably in Southeast Asia and then threw off the debris into across the planet and into space. And that argument has been raging because whichever side you go on, you can explain a certain proportion of the observed data and the anomalies, but not all of it, right? And so each side had some aces, and the others had some jokers, right? So there was this problem that they couldn't really come to a final conclusion as to who was right and who was wrong. But then in the last few years, they had more analysis of lunar rock, and they realized that this material didn't mesh well with debris from the moon's surface, right? So in a sense, the default theory then became the major consensus theory, which is that there was an impact, right? But it didn't necessarily win because it could explain all the evidence. It won because the other side lost, you could say, simply that a piece of data came up they couldn't explain that was really fundamental. So what's wrong with the impact hypothesis? Well, we have a terrible problem here because NASA ran a lot of studies on this material, particularly back in the 60s, I guess, where they realized that the shaping of australite tektite buttons, which is one particular type of this debris, looks like it's been formed by aerodynamic forces. In fact, it's very clear. If anyone goes onto Wikipedia and looks at australite tektite buttons, they will see that it looks like the nose cone of a rocket. It's very obviously been formed through aerodynamic forces. They also replicated the formation of some of this material. And what they found is that the only way you can explain it is if you have a large source body that's in orbit, which then explodes, is superheated for some reason, liquefied into a mineral glass, liquid glass, and then the glass pools into small spheres of liquid as water, will in vacuums, and that then you have instant cooling due to the intense cold of space. So these freeze, and that then you're left with this kind of a cloud of these small spheres of solid glass, and that then they have to also enter into our atmosphere at a shallow, slow, kind of what's called a decaying orbit, essentially. They have to kind of fairly slow and at a fairly shallow angle to then go through secondary melting, but not be just burned up. And then the liquid at the front of the sphere pools towards the back and starts to run back. And then it forms this nose cone shape. And you can see the remnant of the sphere inside it with this kind of a rim around. Again, people can look this up, they'll see those pictures. So if my description doesn't do it justice. Now, having done that, they obviously came to the conclusion that this has to have been formed in space, not from a normal impact event. And then additional to that, they found that there was bubbles of hard vacuum inside some of the debris. Now, if you have an impact on our planet, you have bubbles of air trapped inside, not vacuum, right? And then there's another problem, is that when you look at the Australite debris in total, you find that it's very, very homogeneous, and it's all made out of the same stuff. You know, you take any piece, any two pieces, essentially close to identical in composition, which you don't usually find with impact, because you have lots of times material are being impacted and melted. So you get a range of debris type when you have an asteroid impact. And also something you see with an impact event is around the edges of the crater, you know, you'll have part melt, right, where you have partly melted material. Some of that partly melted material is also thrown out of the impact. Now, with Australite tektite, you don't find that. All of the pieces that have been found are entirely melted. There's no signs of some rock in there, you know, that is partly melted or any of that. So this doesn't mesh at all with an impact. There's a lot of other reasons, but I don't know if you want me to pause it, but I do go on. But I can explain a bit more why, if you like. Also, sorry, I should say that one of the important things about this, again, if this was an explosion of a craft or an object in space, I deduced that, you know, you'd think the debris would go in all directions. So, you know, up, down, everywhere, right?
Right.
I mean, you see that across the surface, but I also wondered, well, could some of it reach the moon, right? Which for me would be kind of almost the clincher. I thought, well, I can't test that. You know, I can't go to the moon. I can't test it. And we've done so little exploration of the moon that I thought, well, it's unlikely that I can never find that out. Now, it was by lucky chance, actually, that, funnily enough, through a contactee, actually, there's a guy, Chris Bledsoe, who's been having a lot of contact experiences, and people can look into that. But a friend of his was a NASA scientist who turns out to be an Australite a tektite expert who spent decades on this topic. And I had a look at his website, having spoken to Chris, and it turns out that on his page that there was this just one article. He mentions that the Apollo 14 and 15 missions, that they found these couple of tiny spheres of glass on the moon, and when they brought them back and they tested one, it was identical in composition to Australite tektite. And I was like, oh man, that's I couldn't have. Right. It was incredible. I was thinking, what's the chance that it turns out they have found Australite tektite on the moon?
And it's so surreal to come to this story from this other story about this woman who was basically spoken to by an alien tablet, and then
absolutely.
You come to this whole mystery, and it's like, wow, that is something. I like
it. Is something. And then to find, as I say, with this piece of evidence, I find it through a contactee case. You know, the guy is friends with a NASA scientist. And again, so in both cases, extraordinary scenarios where they connect to mainstream science and mysteries, which then are better explained by this anomalous scenario than they are by the current, let's say, mundane hypothesis, where the hypotheses don't really explain the evidence. I think that's a key point as well. Keep in mind that there's 100 years of scientists looking at this and arguing, and they can't resolve it. And yet, when you put in this scenario of a large silica, sorry, I should add, the material is 80% silica, right? And that no asteroid or any other body that we've detected so far has more than 60% silica. So it's anomalous in its silica composition, we know that. So you now have an object that's something like 80% silica that is mysteriously parked in Earth orbit, that explodes, and it was dated to 780,000 years ago, and that this material, you know, hits the moon, it hits Earth, it covers 20% of the Earth's surface, it's got hard vacuum in it, you know, it's all the clinchers for something exploding in space. And there I am looking for an object made of silica that blew up in space, you know, orbiting around the planet. So there's a point where you think, well, that's hand in glove. I mean, I've tried reaching out to space scientists. I'm confident enough that, you know, I'm not sort of hiding this within the fringe community. I've reached out to space scientists and astronomers, but nobody's engaged yet. But I would like to have that debate. Can they debunk it? And I'm quite happy to have that kind of conversation.
Yeah, so is the implication that it was possibly some sort of purposeful scatter bomb?
No, in the information that was given, it's blown up. It's blown out of the sky by a rival group.
Oh, interesting.
Now, you know, this this raises the question, we're going back to the moon, or at least we're attempting to, and NASA, European Space Agency, they obviously have more information about anything than we do.
Mm-hmm.
Do we think that they know more than we do? And if so, do we think that they're keeping it from us?
It's hard not to think so. I mean, to me, having stumbled on this, I look at that and I see a glaring potential techno-signature in academic papers. And yet we're being told that NASA and the other private industries and some of these other projects are now looking for alien techno-signatures. They're scouring the universe for techno-signatures, right? But this is now, it's big news lately. And in fact, just this week, more papers came, about the list of things, where we could look for aliens and all this stuff. And yet there in their own papers, there's this mystery of an object made of 80% silica parking itself in orbit at the time that the first Homo sapiens, the archaic Homo sapiens were forming, and a whole load of other strange stuff was happening. And that if it can't occur to these leading edge thinkers that this is essentially, at the very least, worth following up if you're looking for techno-signatures, have something that is breaking the norms in that large objects typically, if they head towards us, they hit us, or they are accelerated past us. We don't tend to capture, as far as I know, I looked into this, the consensus seems to be that it's almost impossible for Earth to capture large bodies as small moons. Right? Yes, some car-sized objects and like that, but it takes something as massive as Jupiter or Saturn to really capture, comets and large asteroids. So what is this object? How is it parking itself in orbit? Why is it made of 80% silica versus all other bodies that we've detected with a maximum of 60? That to me is the glaring indications of a possible alien techno-signature. Now, I don't have a lab and things to go back over that, and retest it with that in mind, but they do. And so there is a bit of me that thinks, well, if you know that everything you've thrown at this leaves it as an anomaly, and your two camps of scientists have waged war for decades and cannot explain it, right? At what point do you say, should we take the view that this could be a AI silica network of the type we are theorizing extraterrestrials will have, that they would explore? Again, this isn't my theory. I don't come up with, and they're telling us they think most of these civilizations will rove space in giant silica networks, in some cases moon-sized objects, because of the processing ability of something like that just being super intelligence. It's godlike super intelligence. Moons made of silica. You think on that scale, this is the kind of they're theorizing. And now you've got something that's like 2 kilometers across, made of mostly of silica, parking itself in orbit. Now, doesn't it seem to you that there's somebody in the whole of NASA and in all of these leading edge figures, somebody would say, should we look at this as a possible techno-signature?
Yeah, why do you think that they're so... we've only recently found some scientists who are willing to even say that these things are a possibility,
Mm-hmm.
And that implication either to me is that we have some seriously closed-minded scientists, which I find it hard to believe because that's kind of contrary to being a scientist.
It is, yeah.
Or we're being wrangled on some level where they think, like Brookings report, like we're all going to freak out or something like that. They have just started to entertain the possibility publicly, and even then it is just an incredibly small amount of them. It makes me wonder just why keep it from us.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a combination of issues. I do think that there's some dissemination, a slowed dissemination of information in the same way that in the last few weeks and the last few months we've seen the UFO topic being transformed into something socially acceptable to discuss, and that now that the government are being asked to share UFO research with us, and the military are saying that there's a possible threat. That is a subject being transformed in a kind of drip kind of fashion. Indeed, in this week, in terms of so I write about genetic engineering. Now we're being shown they're doing experiments showing that how you can create the human brain in a primate through genetic engineering. Another topic, obviously. But I feel that there's some degree of dissemination. I don't think that I have found something that nobody else has ever found. That's my instinct, is that I have not found something that nobody else has ever found. That what I have found is something that is probably known by a number of scientists and officials, and that they are gradually thinking of ways to put this out there. and that we're slowly being told that, yes, we should look for technosignatures, first far away, and then we're told maybe we'll look for technosignatures in our solar system. And then we're told that genetic engineering, oh yes, you could engineer a species. We're almost being prepped for the story that I've got in the book, in a way, which in an odd way, very odd way. In fact, topics that are in there, which I keep in mind, the book was submitted, in April last year. And now, all the news, retroviruses and gene drives and all these things which I talk about, they're all in the news. UFO topic, and I discuss about why SETI have blindness to this topic, and again, a lot of those issues are coming up. There's a team over in Spain, led by I think Dr. De La Torre, and he writes about this thing called the cosmic gorilla effect. Now, this is essentially an experiment they did where they found that if you put a load of academics into a situation to look for an anomaly in an image, and in this case they used a gorilla on a planetary surface, that they found that the people that had the very logical, structured kind of minds of typical academics, right, compared to artistic thinkers, that they were the ones who usually missed the anomalies. And that's kind of funny. They found that it was the more intuitive, artistic thinkers that would find these anomalies. And so I think there is a degree of blindness that is happening in these academics, that they are missing the anomalies. And that is worrying in respect, because you remember, we're trusting that these are the people, these science-based scientists are the people looking for the anomaly. How do you find an alien civilization if you can't see anomalies? Because they are going to be an anomaly. Everything about them is going to be anomalous for us, right? We assume that. You should assume that. So now, if these turn out to be the worst people for looking for anomalies, that's an additional element here. I think that there's probably a lot of people who genuinely do not know about this, in space sciences, and are looking, but have these blindness issues. And then, of course, you have, on the other side, I do think there must be some people that have at least looked into this Australite mystery with a different view. I mean, it just, to me, it's too extraordinary that you'd have, with all your best minds thrown at it and knowing that it remains anomalous, that nobody in the whole of NASA hasn't said, could this be an alien technology of some sort that can park itself and is made of silica? And I don't know. I mean, what do you think? I mean, it just seems unusual.
Not to derail, but this has been nagging at me. This tablet, where is it now?
Yeah, it was. First of all, I say I've never seen it. So I take it on account from Valerie that what happened was the lady gave it to her to temporarily look after whilst she was ill in hospital, and then eventually returned to collect it, and it was forwarded on back to the indigenous people in Uluru. They now have it. So as far as I know, I assume that they have it, and they may have others. They may not just be one. I mean, the law seems to suggest more than one. Unfortunately, the tradition also is that you cannot see images of these. You shouldn't share pictures, or anything. So again, you're in a catch-22. That even if she had seen it or she had taken it, if she did that, it's like really insulting to the indigenous people. So kind of, because it's really a sacred object. It's not supposed to be seen by anyone. It's kept in they'd be kept in caves by the clever fellas, which are the shamans, right, of the tribes, and they were the only people that interact. These are considered to be, really secret knowledge and really. I suppose probably risky for the average person to interact with. So only these kind of shamanic, psychic experts would interact with this thing, which again talks to the idea of it having some kind of psychical influence, that they would deal with this.
So in this culture, there's actually like a tradition of these shamans. That's like a thing for them. Okay.
Absolutely, yeah. And they would have, occasionally in a ritual setting, there's one of these Chiringas might be brought out, but again, they are usually kept away from everyone else. Yeah, they wouldn't be looked on or touched by the normal populace. It would just be the shamans that would interact with them. James says
it's hard to talk about religion without possibly, hurting somebody's feelings, but I can't help but to see a parallel there with the origin of Mormonism.
Well, what about with the Ark of the Covenant and the tablets of God as well?
Yeah,
and if you look at the Hopi, they say that the Bahana, the white brother, will return with a tablet that they're supposed to have, and that tablets were left to the different groups on Earth. And this law is everywhere. So if you think about it, it's uncanny and suspicious. I think that these, what I would consider to be sort of Bracewell probes, have been left at different locations around this planet, and that in prehistory that they have been interacted with by different groups. And that, we have the Hebrew story that these things are, in some respect, the voice of God speaks through them, and that they, in the tabernacle, and that they shouldn't be looked on by people. They're kept by the high priests, and it's a repeating mythology there, right? So what is going on here? I think that we have objects that have been left by beings in prehistory that interact with us a bit like the obelisks. Back to 2001: A Space Odyssey. What are these things doing? Are they solely monitoring, or are they shepherding? Right? Again, so there's this. Yeah, and I know it's a leap for people. Of course, it's a leap. I can't show them one, but assuming that all these different traditions are talking about real objects, then they sound like Bracewell probes.
I don't know if it is a leap, and there have been a lot of people who have tried to say that through media and science and fiction and all of them put together, they've been trying to slowly open our minds to these possibilities, not unlike a religion, but the religion of reality, to try to slowly open our minds to reality. And I don't know, maybe that is happening.
Well, we're moving into what is clearly a kind of technocratic age, right? With the technocrats and their technology and their technocratic religion. And in some respects, this story would make a good technocratic religion. Now, maybe that should be concerning to us, because I don't think that a technocratic future is all that wonderful looking to me, but this is kind of a story of godlike technology, godlike intelligences, godlike AIs, and which is kind of what we're being spun here by people, at the head of these fields like Bill Gates and Elon Musk. I think they're kind of selling this idea of merging with the machines, and chips in our heads and chips in us, and eventually, where is that going? This sounds a bit like this is the kind of religion they might like us to have. That forget God, forget nature, forget what we should be sort of is the mighty super intelligent AI and our merger with the divine machine, all these ideas. So it is kind of, I don't know, it's an uncanny timing for this information to come out at a moment when really we are on the edge of all these things. We are engineering, just as we're engineering, primates, right? We're changing them, and we're talking about gene editing mosquitoes, right, so that they will become extinct. So we have the gene drives and stuff. Now, in the book, I talk about that as well. I mean, that's, again, you could say is a key point of this. I know we haven't got too much time, but I'll just reiterate that there's an important point here that 780,000 years ago, not only do we have this object orbiting, but that's when we see changes in the genome of early hominins that give rise to the lines of large-brained humans. So us, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and a number of unnamed large-brained hominins that we have interbred with throughout prehistory, but we haven't got their fossils, so we don't give them names yet, right? But we know there's a number of them. They all come out of a number of events that happen there, particularly a gene fusion of chromosome 2, sorry, not gene fusion, and that there's a number of genetic changes, gene changes at that time. When the brain goes into a massive acceleration, we have in the fossil record this sudden upward curve in the cranial capacity, right, at 780,000 years ago. So isn't that uncanny? That we have this object exploding, this silica object in orbit, the hominin genome suddenly is modified in a way that leads to large-brained humans, and at this same point we have the last geomagnetic reversal on this planet, 780,000 years ago, and a multi-directional asteroid bombardment, unexplained, which again is inferred in this information, we're told is engineered, that these beings do that. And that turned out, considering that this information was published 2003, this story, which I based my work on, and just in 2016, they found that there is indeed impact scars from a multi-directional impact event around 780,000 years ago. Nobody knew about it back then. So with all those things pointing to that period, why is it that none of us have really heard of it? And why is it that this isn't a big story? Why isn't there a Nat Geo special on 780,000 years ago, the era of chaos, when we have strange objects in space and asteroid bombardments and a magnetic pole shift and the anomalies in the human genome? Why is that not a bigger story? Why am I having to find out about this in this really abstract, arcane, mystical way, coming out of someone else's encounter with an object? Otherwise, I would have never heard of any of this. That's the truth of this. That's one of the strangest elements. I would not have heard of any of these real-world scientific events without that happening.
Well, I have to admit that you put this together in a way that, we've discussed human hybrids before, and I never really felt that it was explained very well to me. It was always slave people and stuff like this, but this definitely puts it in a realistic, well, I don't know if realistic is the right word, seeing how it's so far out of our understanding, but in a conceivable light. So we really, I don't know. I've really enjoyed this.
Yeah.
We're coming up on the end here. I want to make sure.
Mind-bending stuff.
Yeah, I want to make sure our audience is able to find out more about you.
Sure.
Our guest tonight has been Bruce R. Fenton. His book is Exogenesis, Hybrid Humans, A Scientific History of Extraterrestrial Genetic Manipulation. I know you can get the book on Amazon. Is there any other place that people would find out more about you and follow your stuff?
Sure, yeah. I mean, they can go to my pages. I have brucefenton.info, hybridhumans.net. My co-author, my wife, has danielafenton.com. And also I'm on Twitter quite a lot at Exogenesis HH, as in Hybrid Humans, where people can follow me there and interact with me there. I have an upcoming short video production that's based on this same information, and that should be, I think, at the end of the month, that should be available on Amazon for streaming.
And is that anybody with Prime, or how does that work?
I would assume so. I kind of collaborating with a friend Alex at Skeptico, and he's kind of arranged it. So I don't know specifically how that's going to work, but I would assume so. That if you have Prime, that you probably have access to it, and if not, you could rent it. I think that's most likely. It may also be on YouTube. We're just deducing now, I think, how exactly we're going to put it out, but it's essentially done. So that gives people access. There's also the books on Audible, and on audio services, wherever those are, for those that don't like to read, print or Kindle. I recognize that that's an issue. So yeah, it's accessible. I think the information is accessible. It's everywhere, and people can interact. They can Google all the things we've talked about. They can see that I'm not just pulling these words out of anywhere. I spoke tektites, Bracewell probes, these discoveries of the impact. All these things are out there, that people can go and check for themselves. I'm not just sitting here and conjuring these up, putting them together. Check the dates, check the articles.
Okay, well, you've been listening to Bruce R. Fenton here talking about his book, Exogenesis, Hybrid Humans, A Scientific History of Extraterrestrial Genetic Manipulation. You can find the book on Amazon. I know we all giggled when we said people didn't want to read, but I have to admit I am an audiobook guy, so I personally found that I was laughing because I'm that guy. And he has an upcoming new documentary about it on Amazon, so look for it there. And of course, if you forget any of that information and are looking for links, visit us at radiowasteland.us and we will connect you. Thank you very much for being on the show, Bruce.
Thank you so much. I'm glad you both seemed at least mind expanded and impressed with some of the details, so I'm glad of that.
Yeah.
So thank you very much.
Well, it's fun. We do this because it's fun.
Yeah.
It's fun to think outside of the box, Too much of life is in the box, and I don't know, so many. I don't expect people to be obsessed with finding the answers, but don't be content with not finding them. I think is probably the safest.
And science is the quest for the anomalous in a way, isn't it? It's to rectify the anomalies, explore the strange, and find the answers. So if we don't look at the anomalies, we'll never do that. We can't get to that.
Right. Maybe we need some sort of bank of artsy-fartsy folks like like Kara and I to just look at other people's stuff and point out some
things. Yeah. We probably do have to restructure science to think. If we took that into account, just keep that in mind. Maybe we do need to not leave it just to the the logical-minded brainiacs. It does need more of the arty people.
I think you're right. All right. Well, thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you much.
Welcome to the Radio Wasteland. Hello, my darling. Welcome to the